Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight. The ocean covers 70% of the surface of the Earth, and yet there is a lack of sense of urgency to protect the ocean and therefore protect our future. The United Nations Conference on the Ocean now is taking place in the Portuguese capital Lisbon this week. At the event, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has been calling on countries and world leaders to increase their ambition to recover the ocean.
We must turn the tide.
He urged governments to create climate-resilient coastal infrastructure and to cut carbon emissions in maritime transport. Meanwhile, there were also calls at the conference being made for mapping of maritime territory and more investments in environmental education. But the question really is, could this summit make a difference? Let's ask our panelists. For the UN Ocean Conference in Boca Raton, we have John Englander, an oceanographer and author of the book, Moving to Higher Ground. Also in Santa Barbara, we have Dr. Ira Leifer, who is a chief scientist and CEO of a small atmosphere and oceanographic company, which is called the Bubbleology. I hope I pronounced that right. Research International in Beijing. Last but not least, Ma Jun, director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, founder of the Blue Map app. Welcome, everyone. Now, 70% of the world's surface is covered by water, mainly by ocean. Yet we hardly make much effort earlier to help it so that we help ourselves. Now, with this UN Ocean Conference, what can we expect to be achieved? Whether the conference will be able to achieve much, I think that's an interesting question, isn't it? Mr. Englander, for example, we understand that during the latest WTO, the ministerial conference, the 12th of it, have already achieved agreement on overfishing. And this UN conference is mainly having some kinds of echoing of that in terms of overfishing. So what is the point of this conference and how much can it really achieve beyond what has already achieved?
Well, you're right to be questioning and even skeptical. Unfortunately, we've talked about overfishing for decades. We've talked about the problems of pollution in the ocean for decades. We've said there needs to be better protected areas for marine species and better enforcement for decades. We've said for decades we need to slow the warming by reducing the carbon dioxide being put in the atmosphere. Yeah. So every year we come back together and pledge we must do more because the oceans are so important. And we don't want to give up hope, but we need to be realistic that unfortunately the trends have not been good.
There is always the discussion during the climate change issue, for example, about different countries at different development stages and therefore their obligations, their possibilities, and their efforts that can be made. Now, Mr. Ma, do you think there is a similar discussion that's going on about ocean, or there's likely to be? How can we avoid the earlier traps of mainly debates without achieving much? How can we avoid that in terms of protecting the ocean?
Yeah, you're right. As you mentioned, the ocean is now a major resources, and it's also part of the geopolitical playing ground in some way. When the whole world paying far more attention at this moment on the security of not just national security, but the securities of energy supply, food supply, and industrial supply chain. All this, the ocean all played some role in that. And so it's actually getting more complicated. Having said that, it's encouraging for this second, ocean conference, Global Ocean Conference, to be held in the world, because we all recognize that ocean is our common good. That we as human beings must take care of that. Otherwise, if the ocean one day is really, suffering from, from major
Right.
degradation, then it's going to pose a real threat.
Okay.
And at this moment, I think some of that we have seen some progress, can be made more immediately, more
Like?
instantly. For example, on the overfishing and the cutting of the pollution. For example, the plastic, single-use plastic, a plan to phase out the single-use plastic by 2030 have been agreed upon. So all these are good signs. But on things like global warming, it's going to take much longer because the ocean probably going to warm for hundreds of years before we can, even if we take proper measures tomorrow.
Mr. Englander, what is your thoughts on the priorities on the list from your perspective?
Well, the fishing regulations or the marine protected areas are very important. The rules against pollution going into the ocean like plastics are very important. But then the climate change issue, the third big issue, is of course, and they're all separate issues and they all relate to the oceans. But as our guests have noted this evening or morning in your time, the long-term effect of a warming planet, the heat goes into the ocean, it's melting the polar ice caps, Antarctica and Greenland primarily, and that's going to cause sea level rise. And that's another issue. It's kind of my specialty, but we haven't mentioned it yet. Sea level is going to rise meters higher in the next century or two. And we need to start thinking about designing for a new coastline, something that has not happened in 6,000 years, that sea level will be, in fact, 100,000 years that sea level was higher. So that's a whole nother area that besides the fisheries, the marine pollution, the coral reefs we didn't talk about, which are in decline. There are many ocean issues, but the oceans, of course, dominate this planet.
Fascinating. Dr. Leifer, also your thoughts on the priorities.
In principle, most countries agree that we need to do something about many of these problems, whether it's climate change or oil in the ocean or river runoff. And there are laws to allow that should regulate that. And the problem, which we can tell from satellite data, is enforcement. And so I think what's really important is to provide the tools to allow enforcement and enable it, such as embarrassing companies or fines or whatever, to meet what we can do and we've already agreed to do, to actually do what we've agreed to do.
That is very crucial. Just from your answers, 3 versions of answers about priorities, some of these priorities certainly match with one another, but every one of you have your own perspectives about the priorities. So this is also similar about what happened with our discussion over the years for climate change. What are the priorities? What can be done? How long do you see this discussion will continue before we hit on the nails in a way and sticking to the point? Let's go to Mr. Englander very briefly.
It's probably in the next decade or two that we will get more serious about dealing with climate change, because the accelerating melt in the North and South Pole regions is going to get worse, and we're seeing worse weather, disasters, extreme heat, extreme rain, extreme drought are getting more and more common. But I think in about 10 years, it will become much, much more serious, and we will have to take things more seriously. But it's one of those things, the sooner we act, the better.
Yeah, of course. Dr. Leifer, tell me more about, how is protecting the ocean, can we realign it also with the issues of climate change? As we know, we're likely the world experiencing some real economic difficulties the rest of this year and the next. So priorities, very important. How to, in a way, best use our energy and resources for related issues, very important. Tell me more about your thoughts.
I mean, it makes sense to head for the low-hanging fruit. I agree partially with John in that we have about a decade. It's kind of like COVID, where we see if you don't start early, it runs away and it's very hard to catch up. And so much of these climate changes are exponential. And if we don't catch them now, we may not be able to do it later, no matter what we do. Nature runs the show instead of the humans. And so I think we have about a decade where we're in that initial phase where we can still make rational choices instead of just reacting to whatever super hurricane is barreling down on every coastline every few weeks.
Prevent and also adaptation. Now you are saying we still have some time for prevention before we become only could rely on adaptation. Dr. Ma, tell me more your thoughts on this as well, particularly from the perspective of emerging and developing countries.
Unfortunately, some of the real underdeveloped and developing countries are really going to suffer from this. I mean, especially the island countries. They are, as John put it, when the sea keep on rising, we expect it to keep on rising for more than 1,000 years from now on, and they're going to feel existential threat. And so as our other guests have put it, each of us must do our best, especially me coming from China and John and Ira coming from the United States. We're the two largest economies, but also the two largest emitters globally. So we shared a responsibility to seriously cut our emission. First, we must mitigate, because the only way to prevent the impact on the ocean, the only way is to decarbonize, to cut back carbon emission, to prevent all this acidification, which is having a big impact on coral reef and other species. And then adaptation and how to provide help to the island countries. The Western countries have made commitment about $100 billion per year of this support, which hasn't been materialized. And then in China, we also have our responsibility. So according to the government plan, through the Belt and Road Project, support must be given also to the island countries because we share a global responsibility.